Can you please troubleshoot in the front? Can you check in there?
Yeah.
Okay, we're live. If you have any questions, you are welcome to post them in the chat as we're going on, especially if they are IT troubleshooting. Otherwise, I'm going to do a Q&A session at the very end where you can ask all sorts of questions at that time. So first, welcome to my house, because you have to do these things indoors, but it doesn't mean we can't still connect. My name is Jennifer Beamer. I am a final year PhD student at the University of Leicester, and I'm in the middle of doing an experiment that I thought would be really interesting to share, because it brings together a lot of different aspects of both my life and my research life, but also how we engage with the archaeological record in the past. So I wanted to extend a thank you to Ross Turrell, who is the current curator at Chilcombe House, where the Danebury Archive is held. And through that opportunity, I was able to do a lot of my research on those tools directly. And I had access to all the excavation records. Plus, he was very accommodating and did send me some things so that I could look at them in the lab here at the University of Leicester. So thank you for allowing me to really get hands-on experience working with archives. And the second thing I wanted to thank, or second group of people I wanted to thank, my supervisors, Mary Harlow and Jeremy Taylor. It was very important for me to have co-supervisors in this regard, because I'm also an archaeologist at heart, always have been, and I wanted someone to really help me push my knowledge about textiles and to think in ways that I might not otherwise think as an archaeologist. So part of this project has been balanced because I've had two really great researchers helping me with this project. So I just wanted to briefly go over how today's session is going to be structured. So I'm going to do a little bit of detail on the setup and sort of like what I was going through to get this experiment set up. And so that does require a little bit of orientation with this particular project. And then sort of in the latter half, I'm going to do some demonstrations, both with the Loom here, so you can see how I'm kind of working. And then I'm also going to do a spinning demonstration with Hemp. And then, as I said at the very end, I'm going to have a Q&A session, so you can ask all sorts of questions you want. And we'll probably end up going over the end time at 3, but it's fine because I'll stay here and answer as many questions as I can. Okay? Okay, so just very briefly, a little bit of history about me. Like a lot of people who get into crafts usually get into it at an early age, whether it's sewing or knitting or crocheting. You've seen like grandparents doing stuff. You might have seen like someone working with leather or stitching at a tailoring shop in town when you're growing up. These they're not necessarily as common today, but they're there. And you've probably had exposure to crafts from a very young age. And that was exactly my experience. Started off watching my great grandmother do crochet, my grandmother do embroidery and sewing, and the same thing with my mom. So it was inevitable that I was going to become interested in textiles. Now, academically, I got into the experimental stuff when I was doing a master's in museum studies, looking at Peruvian textiles and cochineal dye. And I wanted some way to kind of incorporate experiments. And I came up with a dissertation, which was well done. So that was good. But I really felt invigorated by doing all this research with textiles and experimentation. So it was just sort of a matter of building off of that. And so in 2015, I decided to go back to school to get a master's degree in Iron Age archaeology, looking at textiles and textile production. And then in 2017, January, I launched my PhD project, which is re-examining experimental archaeology, which was looking at Iron Age textile production and re-examining what others had said about it, and also looking at deposition, because in Iron Age Britain, a lot of these textile tools aren't found in context of production. And so when you're looking at the archaeological record and how this relates to production, taking into consideration the context really matters, because if people are taking, for example, lots of loomites out of production for deposits in pits, then it can potentially skew the way that you look at the production. So there's a lot of interesting things kind of all wrapped up with textile production. So for me, it's been very challenging trying to unpick all of this. But in having looked at a variety of textile tools, I'm much more well informed now about the textile production sequence. And so it, for me, hasn't just been about looking at one type of textile tool like loomites. It's been about looking at the entirety of the sequence and trying to sort of get an understanding of what the different textile tools might have done, like what tasks they performed. So my PhD project isn't an experimental PhD. However, in my spare time, I have done a lot of work with experimental archaeology, and I have done several experiments now looking at the same kinds of questions. And it's been an exercise of not just looking at how loom weights function on the work-weighted loom, but how the impact of the type of fiber you're using, whether you're using wool or plant fiber, and how it's being spun, whether it's drafted or spliced, like the textiles at Must Farm, for example, which is a late Bronze Age site in Cambridgeshire. And all of these considerations need to be thought about prior to the experiment. So, really quickly, what is experimental archaeology? Sometimes when we get really caught up with what does a term mean, we get very academic. But in the simplest sense, we're basically experimenting, or we're engaging in the experimentation process. Now, let's say, for example, you have a shirt and a button has fallen off. What do you do about it? Well, you've never confronted the situation before. And so you might experiment by finding a solution to the problem. So you have this button that's popped off your shirt. What do? You might just skip it. Didn't need that button anyway. Or maybe you have a friend who knows how to sew and you ask them very kindly and they sew it on for you. Problem fixed. Or you can learn how to do it yourself. And if you don't know how, you can either ask somebody who does know and they can teach you, or we have YouTube, which is sort of the kingdom of all tutorials. So you can go there, see someone who's done it, and then you can learn how to sew on your button yourself and have that skill for the next time something like this happens. Or you can pay somebody to put that button back on for you, which is pretty common these days, to take clothing that needs to be altered or fixed to a tailor to have it done professionally, because some of these skills we don't have the time or energy or interest in doing ourselves, which is totally fine. But that option exists. So that's sort of experimentation. You don't know how to put this button on, and if you want to put it on, you have to find out how to do that. So experimental archaeology is sort of one step further towards having a very firm structure about how to do the experimental process with the archaeological record. So I have a video of this on my YouTube channel if you're interested in hearing a fuller explanation. But basically, with experimental archaeology, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to use this and this and this to do my experiment, when actually, for the time period that you're trying to examine, these choices don't make a lot of sense. Either those materials wouldn't have existed, or that processing capability wasn't present at the time. So you have to be very careful about what you choose, and it has to always relate back to the archaeological record. So in sum, those are the two main differences between experimentation or exploratory research, where you're just trying to see what works, and experimental archaeology, which has a much more rigid structure. But here's the great thing about experimental archaeology. You can often get access, especially with open access journals, to some of the relevant information for you to do experimental archaeology on your own. And it doesn't have to be groundbreaking. All you have to do is think about how it relates back to whatever archaeology you're looking at. And this transcends beyond just textile production. It also includes any kind of craft production. So my experiment obviously is with textiles. So I'm going to be framing the rest of the session based around that. But it's got a lot of applicability within schools, because textiles are really great for teaching. We're exposed to textiles all the time. We engage with textiles pretty much every day. And textiles often make our lives easier. If anyone has carried around a backpack full of books, knows exactly what I'm talking about. So because they're familiar, because the awareness of them is so relatively high, it's an easy thing to discuss about, and you can build other more abstract topics based off textiles, things like personhood, identity, etc. Okay? All right. So I will show you now. How is the speed? Is it okay? Am I talking too fast? I have a tendency to be too excited. So one of the things I wanted to do when I first started doing these experiments was to consider my parameters altogether. So I decided to do a pre-experiment, and that was to tell me important things that I might not otherwise know about my setup. Now, it doesn't always have to be the case, but it can be insightful. So if you are going to invest a lot of time and money into the materials for your experiment, it's an important consideration so that you can check for any potential problems and develop contingency plans for in case something doesn't work. And that's actually the beauty of experimental archaeology, is sometimes things don't work, especially the way that we think they might. And rather than being upset, it's a very humbling experience to make us sort of think differently about how we approach the experiment, how we approach the materials, etc. Right? And so that's exactly what I did. So I did this little experiment here, and I produced these very skinny, small little textiles. And I learned a lot about how to do my setup for each one. So hopefully you can see some detail there. If not, I'll try to take some photos and post them elsewhere. But as you can see, I did several little samples from this early experiment. And I kept track of all the information of what I did on a piece of note card so that all that information was together. I also kept a log of all of the details relating to what I did, why I made different choices or changes, how I felt as I was weaving or setting things up, the kinds of problems that I encountered during the process, because all of this would have been informed. It would be informative for when I actually set up the full experiment so that I could see what to look out for or how I needed to change technique, which we'll come back to later, so that I could do the experiment and not have a complete mess, tangle of yarn on my hands. So that was important for me. So the tools I use were roughly based on equivalents from Danebury. And Danebury is an Iron Age hill fort located in Hampshire, United Kingdom. And it is in hill fort country. So it's that part of southeastern Britain where there are a lot of Iron Age hill forts. And because of Barry Cunliffe's extensive archaeology there, I was able to get quite a large sample of all the textile tools I wanted to look at. And they were spindle whorls, loom weights, long-handled combs, and needles. Now, needles explicitly weren't included in the textile production tool set originally, because it was assumed that they were probably more for leather working. But if you've done any kind of sewing or stitching, or even just, fixing something to the loom, needles are really helpful for this. So I included them with this research, and I think I have over about 860 tools in a database that I've called upon to do this experimental research. So when you're doing an experimental program, it's very helpful to do the research to a sufficient degree so that you have a good sense of what is available to you, so that when you set up your experiment, the parameters of your experiment make sense for what you're trying to achieve with the experiment and the kind of questions that you can ask. So that's limited by the archaeological record. So some things you can say with certain confidence, others you can't. So for me, I decided to take on the question of heavy loom weights, because in Iron Age Britain, a lot of the loom weights that we have, or what we think are loom weights, are very heavy. And there have been a series of papers talking about this, and other people have commented kind of anecdotally. But loom weights being heavy has somewhat deterred people from really being convinced that these heavy objects were loom weights, and have suggested that maybe they would be doorstops, or they would be useful for holding down thatch, which are all possible reasons to use such heavy objects. But the kinds of wear patterns I was seeing and the consistency of their sizes made me think that perhaps these heavy objects needed to be examined further. And so when I looked more deeply into this, I saw a debate about triangular loom weights and triangular oven bricks. And that was put forward by Cynthia Poole because the way she was finding them in Iron Age pits at Danebury suggested that maybe they're actually more related to oven architecture than it would be on a loom. Now, I felt it was very important to investigate these triangular clay objects for that specific reason, and so that's why I opted for the triangular shape made out of clay. Now, I've used a proxy, I've used an air-dried clay to make mine, but the principle involved was important for me to look at the shape and the mass rather than the specific material. Do we have a question? Okay. I got a signal from my IT support.
I'm sure if you wanted to pan down or not.
Oh, I'll show you exactly when I finish the setup. So the spindle whorls at Danebury, it was important for me to look at the entire production sequence. So it's not just about what loom weights they had, but also what kinds of spindle whorls they had, because if the spindle whorls couldn't produce the kinds of yarns that would be useful for the loom weights, then you get into the question of local production versus imports. So with Barry Cunliffe's original assessment of textile production at the Iron Age Hill Fort, Danebury, it was a question of how production was set up, and it was stated that it might be a textile production center where yarns were being imported, which may be the case, but I was interested in local production. So I looked at the spindle whorls, and I selected one that was 14 grams. On a spindle, it would have been 17 grams total. And I spun a sufficient sample that you can see here. It's been a little bit messed up over all of the traveling I've done with it, but you can see how relatively fine the threads are. Yeah. So it was important for me to use a proxy to get a sense of whether it was possible to make a yarn with an equivalent spindle whorl that would have been found at Danebury during the Iron Age period. And so I spun this to make sure that it was feasible for me to go with a proxy for my loom setup here. And then the third tool that I wanted to work with were long-handled combs. Now, for my research question, I didn't actually deal with that directly, but what I did do was I used exploratory experimental archaeology to kind of get a sense of how to use this tool. If it's for weaving, how would I use it? So I was using this original experiment setup to also investigate another question, just so that I understood how to do a full experimental archaeological program for long-handled combs, because there's a lot of controversy surrounding whether they're for weaving or for combing wool or for taking the flesh off of animal hides. We don't know yet, and it requires a lot of experimentation and lots of different scholarship kind of contributing to it. But I'm using it here, but it's not part of the main aspect of my research. And then the last thing, needles. I've used a needle to adhere the top of the weaving to the loom, and I use it at the very end when I'm making seams. And last year, when I did this experiment, I did exactly that. So you can see where I've made a rolled hem here. And actually from the other side, you can't really see where I've made the stitches. And this is where I'm operating a little bit with our near neighbors at Hallstatt. This is an Iron Age flat fell seam that I did as part of the experiment with this piece. And I know it's really difficult to see, but essentially I have taken the two raw edges and I folded them in on themselves, kind of like that, completely encased, and it's otherwise a flat piece of fabric. So even though this doesn't exist for Danebury, in fact, no textiles have been recovered from Danebury, as far as I know. So we don't know more specifically what's happening in southeastern Britain when it comes to textile production, because no one, as far as I know, has done a lot of this experimental research. However, as I will show you in just a second, it's been very, very insightful. Okay, So as I was saying about the operational sequence, I confirmed with my proxies that I could theoretically make a yarn based on a spindle whorl that came from Danebury in a context that is similar to the other textile tools that were recovered. They're not always completely together in the same pit, but relative context, if it's from the same date period, you could reasonably assume that they might have been used all together. And when it came to setting up the loom weights, I didn't really have a lot to go on, but I did two orientations. The first kind was with the triangular shapes with the points facing up. And then the second type, as I will show you here in a second, I have one triangular shape pointing up and the other pointing down. Maybe. Yeah, okay. So if I show you this loom weight, how it's point up, all of the loom weights in the back are point up. And then in the front, all of the loom weights are point down. Now, this orientation was discussed, I think, by Fabienne Medard in 2003, when she was looking at the Parisian examples, which these are very similar in that size range. But also Dee DeRoche, when she wrote her PhD thesis in 1995, also proposed this orientation, which I have taken to heart when I set up this experiment. But when I actually start weaving, you'll see how they kind of slide up to each other, but their impact is somewhat reduced. So this is a really effective shape for a couple of different reasons. It reduces the chances of the weights smacking into each other and creating wear and damage, but also their triangular shape allows them to be oriented in different ways because they often will have multiple sets of perforations. So my original research question was very, very, very simple. Because I didn't have any real research or experimental research to work with prior to starting this experiment, I decided to go with the most basic question that I could ask and get a reasonable answer for. And the question was, can heavy loom weights function as loom weights? And I also wanted to investigate whether triangular clay objects could function on a loom. And from the first experiments I did, the answer was yes. Now, going back to my proxies, when I was using heavy loom weights, I was concerned about how they would be able to how the yarns would be able to support a heavy loom weight, because everything I had read suggested that they wouldn't work because the threads would snap. Looking at the environmental data for Danebury, there were indications of flax being grown nearby. So even though we don't really have things like retting pits and we don't have textile charred bits, we do have some evidence that flax was being used. And so I took that as an opportunity to experiment with flax, despite the fact that the Iron Age period is often characterized as being based on a sheep economy, and wool as a byproduct of sheep, then people would be weaving with wool. And whereas I believe that to definitely be the case at Danebury, because the numbers of sheep are quite numerous, it doesn't diminish the fact that flax was also there, and the conversation about it as a fiber source hasn't been started really. So I used flax because of those reasons. But in addition, when I was dealing with heavy loom weights, flax can handle about 2 times the amount of tension than wool can before it will snap. So if I'm working with heavier loom weights, I felt more confident in exploring linen in this case than I would have with just wool. Although, with any good experimental program, building on from this is important. So I do have wool set up to be experimented on next. So without further ado, I'm going to do a little demonstration about my weaving, and you are free to ask some questions, and I will answer them as best as I can. Okay? So one of the things I have learned is how to drape the weft so that when I push it into place, I don't have the edges coming in on themselves. And this is, when I was talking about technique, it's really important to consider because we're talking about isolating objects and the way that they function from the crafter who is operating all of these tools. And so we can't ask them as informants. All we have is the archaeological record, and we try our best to kind of look at that missing insider knowledge, the crafter. So this experiment has helped me understand just how important it was for the crafter to have knowledge not only of weaving, but also if they needed a specific type of yarn spun, they would be able to tell a spinner or someone who spins more predominantly in the sequence what exactly they needed. So you're often communicating across different craft spheres so that you can produce something that is acceptable for whatever reason you need to make it. So again, technique is important because it can be manipulated depending on what you want the end result to be, how you have everything set up, but also in how that person or a group of people, depending on how intensive the production is, might have dealt with those situations. So I was recently looking at photos of the work-weighted loom products from Scandinavia, and sometimes you'll see quite beautiful textiles that have slightly wobbly edges, and sometimes it's just very difficult to do, but also it makes me question whether it really mattered as much. So in the world of everything being really perfect, we also have to ask what might have been acceptable from their understanding. And I feel like that's where a lot of creativity with the craft comes into place, because we don't know their motivations for doing this or doing that. All we can sort of say is like they were probably doing this or they might have done that. But in some ways it does kind of diminish how the crafter might have viewed that particular work. If they were making something with fine yarns like I am now, they might have put in more care. If they were working with coarser yarns or a wool fabric that was going to be felted into a cloak or something, they might have cared less or might have fumbled around with the textile less during the making of it, because it wouldn't have mattered as much. So there are some interesting intersections, I believe, where experimental archaeology and experimentation can kind of work together so that you understand different aspects and different perspectives. Any questions? Does anyone have any questions? I might just yammer on, which I'm known to do.
Seems like everyone's content to listen.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have a more interesting American accent. Just from the Midwest. What time is it?
It's 2:36.
Okay, good. We're doing really good on the time. Now I'll talk a little bit about my comb. This was actually made for me. This is based on a Danebury comb. And it was made for me by an Etsy shop, which I have failed to remember the name of it. But she has worked a lot with wood, but also made this out of antler. And she's actually making me some needles and another comb for a different experiment. So this usage of the comb is one of the ones that has predominantly featured within the discussion of textile production in Iron Age Britain as being weaving combs.
We have a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, question.
Hazel Crab asks, please could you explain what you're doing with threads? I'm new to looming.
Okay.
Sorry if it's a silly question.
It's not a silly question. So basically what I've done here, if you can see in frame, yeah, you can see it here. So I have heddled or separated out certain threads. And the way that weaving works is you have two planes, right? So you have, let's say, 10 threads. And if I split it into two planes, I'll have 5 threads in the front and 5 threads in the back. But I don't just want it to be all 5 consecutively. I want it to be 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 threads in the front and 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 threads in the back so that they open up where I can put the yarn in and it will go over, under, over, under. So these are the warps and the ones I'm putting in are the wefts. So I'm splitting the warps into front and back, and I'm taking the weft and putting it perpendicular to them so that when I change the sheds by moving what's called the heddle rod here, I will change the front threads for the back threads, like so. So now this thread is caught in here. It's because the threads are clasping over it. So, like that. And every single weft that I put in is called a pick. And this is made up of many picks or many weft threads being put in. And this structure is what keeps the threads from unraveling into individual pieces of yarn at the end. And you can do this with a piece of cardboard with string wrapped around it. And then you take a contrast thread and you go over, under the whole way, back and forth, and you'll get a little piece of fabric at the end. And it doesn't matter what thread you do have, most people will have these kinds of materials at home, so you can experiment with weaving very, very easily. You don't need any expert knowledge in order to make a small piece of fabric. Any other questions? I can also refocus down here at the bottom so that you can see how the loom weights are operating. Now I know it's going to be a little bit complicated in this particular setup, but I do have a video that I'm hopefully going to put out on YouTube relatively soon, where I demonstrate more fully how these work. But if you see how I pulled them up, oh, I've actually adjusted the back ones up too high, but you can see here where they kind of just slide up next to each other. I made a last minute decision before filming. But I think you understand the point I'm trying to make with the loom weights themselves.
I have another question.
Yes.
So it looks like the back thread's not laying down straight because of short heddles. So you have a big distance between the front and back. Okay, it's retracted.
Oh. Yeah, so basically what I've just done is
Back. All right.
The back weights, because the point sorry.
What was the advantage of the short heddle? What is the advantage of the short heddle?
Of this one?
Yes.
The short heddle. I guess I think I might need a little more clarification. If you're referring to this.
So you have no big distance between the front and back layers. So what is the advantage?
Oh, okay.
Short
You're
heddles.
talking about the shed space. There's probably about 2 inches. And that is just because when I set this up originally, I had another one of these behind here. And so it was being dictated to a certain extent because of the thickness of the beam here. So this is a 2x4. And so I used this as the difference between the front and the back, because when I had, I don't know if you can see here, but when I had this bar here, I had another one behind it, and it was only a distance about like that. So that's why the shed distance is actually quite narrow, but the angle of the loom overall is probably optimal for weaving, because it's, I'd say, maybe 75 degrees from perpendicular. So I do have a good natural shed that is formed, but like I said, because the thickness of the loom structure was only about 2 inches, the distance in the shed is going to be a little more than 2 inches.
Question?
Sure.
Would there have been patterns woven into the cloths, such as a herringbone, or do you think it would have been predominantly a plain weave?
Well, the interesting thing about the weaves is we don't really know. I've only seen one textile fragment from Hertfordshire, and it was plain weave, but I wasn't able to do any identification with it when I was at the British Museum. That's where it's held. And I'm not as familiar with the textiles of the North, because, as I said in the start, I was looking only at the textile production capabilities of Danebury and the surrounding sites around it, because I was interested in local production. In terms of patterns, with wool, you will get a lot of twills. And you can see that actually from the record in East Yorkshire. However, with fabric drape, for example, this is a tabby. It's the most basic weave structure. it's better to use linen for it because it maintains its rigid structure more than a twill might. And that has to do with the points of connection between where a yarn goes over and a yarn goes under. So, for example, with linen, it made more sense for me to use a tabby structure for plain weave setup to demonstrate it. But it's not to say that you couldn't use twill for this. And for wool, I do think it's slightly more common to see a mixture of tabby and twills, like different types of twills. But again, without any textile record from Danebury, it's really hard to extrapolate what the textiles would have looked like otherwise. So maybe.
Dolores Kearney asks, can you recollect the number of pin beaters from Danebury?
So the pin beaters, there aren't that many that would qualify for that. And mostly I would say they are needles because there is an indication of a perforation on one end. However, with pin beaters, they're not necessarily called such at Danebury. I often see them called points or sometimes owls. And I think it comes down to the way that archive has been produced because it was, excavated in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. So it was said that there were some tools that might have been part of this sequence, which couldn't readily be identified. So because I was already looking at so many other things with the textile tools I had selected, I couldn't look at pins or these bobbins made out of the short metapoidal bones of sheep. Those might have been used for weaving. So instead of using one of these types of shuttles, that might have been used. It was also suggested it might have been related to tapestry weaving, which is a possibility. This is just one possible way that people were making textiles at Danebury. And that's because we've got the loom weights as the archaeological evidence. But with pins, I'd have to look at the book again to see how many they have recorded. I don't think it's a lot, and I did look at some, so maybe I'll find some photos and I can send them on to you. That would be good.
And Aldous asks, why a vertical loom? Could you still use loom weights on a horizontal loom?
Oh, that's actually a very interesting question and something I really hadn't considered in that way, because I do know with tablet weaving, you will sometimes use a loom weight on the other end to serve as the counterweight to the weaving process. That, as far as I know, there weren't any tablets discovered at Danebury. I have seen what tablets look like up in Scotland. They're made out of bone and they're quite small. But I think the Center for Textile Research kind of explored the usage of small spool weights with tablet weaving. There are some tools that kind of fit in no man's land with in regards to the Iron Age textile section for Danebury. So it could be that maybe they were doing some kind of tablet weaving, and if they were using wooden tablets, it's unlikely for those small objects to survive, because I think there was only like a couple of wooden artifacts actually preserved at Danebury, so the soils just aren't good for wood preservation. So it could be that some of these smaller objects could have been used with tablet weaving or small rigid heddle loom weaving. I don't know. In which case you would have some kind of horizontal structure versus a vertical structure with weaving. In terms of something like a horizontal ground loom, I don't know if there's really any evidence for that in the ground. also, there's been a lot of discussion about the viability of that in the UK where it rains a lot. So you'd have to be very careful about when you're weaving. And if you are weaving outside and there's rainfall, it would probably make sense to find some way to like cover the work area, either with some kind of tent fabric, so that the weaving doesn't get wet, because when wool gets wet and you try to weave with it, it's horrendous. Even to a certain extent with linen, because it will stick to itself. When you spin it, you'll often lick and spin, and that moisture reinvigorates the pectin in the linen so that it sticks together. So it's possible, but I'm at the early stages of exploring all of this. So I haven't seen anything thus far that would really convince me that this is the case. Although these tools have been the argument for their presence of small looms, like band looms, where tablet weaving is happening. Although this requires a lot more investigation and experimental work to kind of get a sense of what that might be like. So, if it's all right with you guys, I'm going to shift towards spinning with my hemp and my dye stuff. Yeah. And we can always circle back to some of these questions and I can move on from there. I think I left my water somewhere else.
There.
No, I got a little tub of water. I think it's on the table in there. Okay. So, first disclaimer, none of these tools is, strictly speaking, part of this experiment, and they're not necessarily archaeologically viable, although you could say that this loomate, or sorry, this spindle whorl here is broadly similar to the ones that I recorded for Danebury. Whether it was a top whorl or a bottom whorl, I don't know. The evidence on the perforation seems to be rather inconclusive. And I don't know if they were spinning hemp. But what this does show you is how important it is to just engage with the process, because it's not just about how you are doing things to perfection. It's sometimes just about how you're engaging with the process, because it helps you think. When you've done it, you realize, well, how did they manage the fiber supply? We don't know if they were using linen or flax at Danebury, but if they were spinning it, were they spinning it as a draft fiber, like I'm going to show you, or were they splicing it like we've seen at Must Farm, which doesn't require this kind of setup? It's a very different set of gestures and tools and just ways that you go about doing the process. So it helps you think. And that is where I'm going with this. Now I'm going to get this started and be really quiet because I'm still a beginner at this. So as I said, I'm using the water to help with keeping the fibers smoothed down as I go. And I'm literally just pulling down and moistening as I go, giving a bit more twist to the spindle. Drafting, re-wetting. And as I said, this is just dealt with problems. It gets me thinking about how people might have dealt with yarns spun by beginners. Would they have used this yarn? My thought is probably yes, because if they're spending all this time and energy gathering up and processing all this material, whether it's flax, whether it's wool, whether it's gone through the process of being fully retted so that you expose the inner fibers, whether it's a good quality fleece or a bad quality fleece, if they're making yarn, even if it's not very good, they'd probably use it for something. And so it makes you think more than just about cloth for clothing. So would they have used certain kinds of spun yarns for not woven items? And the answer is probably yes. Because we're humans and we often think about what they looked like, because it relates to how we think about how people were wearing the clothing while they're out doing other activities. We come back to that question of, well, what did they look like? And there have been loads of suggestions about what people in the Iron Age were wearing, where we have textile remains from the north or continental Europe. But when you are living in a society where everyone is contributing to some aspect of it, and children were engaging in the process as well, they may not have produced high quality yarns at first, but that learning process teaches them a lot because it exposes them to what is required of them when they're processing the wool or the linen, what they need in order to make a really quality, strong yarn, whether it's going to be used for weaving or for some other kind of process. Question?
A question, wouldn't they have learned how to at a young age, though?
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly believe that Iron Age children would have grown up witnessing all of this production and would have been helping to either help with spinning or processing of the fibers. They might have been restricted from certain things depending on their age level, and possibly other like cultural reasons. Maybe it was part of some kind of hesitate to say like a rite of passage, but I think you understand what I mean. So there's that, but also not everyone is equally good at the making of a textile. So depending on how a community is set up, it might be more or less integrated with another community during the Iron Age. And in some cases, you might have someone who's just exceptionally good at spinning or weaving. And by comparison, the work of others, it works, but it's not necessarily as beautiful or as finely produced. So there was a lot of variation, I'm sure, among the skill. Sometimes at the end of the day, it might just be about producing so that you have what you need. I like to call this specifically the acceptable parameters. And we don't know what those were, but sometimes you can see with the manufacturing of the textile tools themselves what they might have considered acceptable. Because even in cases where, like long-handled combs, for example, if the tines aren't perfectly spaced, but there are still indications it was used for something, it tells me that the specific distances didn't matter as much as the fact that it worked for whatever it was being used for. Even if it wasn't the original intended purpose, the fact remains they used it. So in a sense, it kind of gives you an idea of the range of variability among various kinds of textile tools. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 10 tines. It could be 12 would be fine. Okay. So again, I was hoping that wouldn't happen. But as you can see, when you are 10 years a spinner and you're trying something new, sometimes just the different materials or the different setups or the different kind of bodily gestures can surprise you publicly. So I just wanted to finish quickly in case anyone was interested with this experiment. This is the follow-up to an experiment that I concluded at the beginning of June, where I was looking at different setups. And when it comes to actually doing an experiment, it's not just about, well, can you do it for 10 rows? Sure. Sometimes it's much more helpful to see full length or extended periods of time so that you get a sense of what is consistent or what could be consistently made with this process so that you achieve a greater understanding of like the qualifications you can have with your research question. So if I had only done a short little sample, I might not have had the insights garnered from producing a much bigger piece of fabric or even doing follow-up experiments to confirm my parameters make sense for the next person or me to replicate it based on my previous experiment as a guideline. So it's always a work in process and it's accretional. So what I've learned from each time doing this, I kind of take that knowledge with me as I go, but I also record it. So if I needed to go back and find out why something didn't work, I can see what epiphany I had previously that I somehow forgotten. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this session, and I will give you, I don't know, depending on the questions, just like 10, 15 minutes to ask me whatever. I can show you some more things. I can elaborate a little bit more. I can try doing some more camera work, maybe. Take a sip of water here. I also have a lot of abstracts that I've done conference papers for on academia.edu. And you can go there and see sort of like the different types of topics I have looked at more specifically. And if you wanted to follow up with me about anything more, that would also be a good place to find me. Or else you can find me at the University of Leicester in the archaeology department. Well, if no one has any other questions they would like to ask.
Loris Kearney says the shine on your linen is fabulous.
Oh, actually, one of the things that I did with this linen.
Oh, got a question.
Was in this section here, actually, I beat the fabric with a piece of wood, like I used a rolling pin to flatten it a bit more, and actually it is a lot shinier. I don't know if I could really capture it with pictures, but it is noticeably shinier than the rest of the piece of fabric. So
someone wanted to see the top of the loom.
Okay, yeah, go for it. So this is my supervisor's loom, and she had it made by somebody who was given the problem of trying to create a demonstration loom. So this is in no way accurate, but it is operational at the very least. And so what I've done is, rather than do a tablet woven border, I've just kind of strung a yarn through and I've tied it to the top band here. And as you can see by me, like, this is stretching at my tippy toes. It's actually probably about 6.5 feet tall, I'd say. It's very tall loom. And actually, if you look here, I don't know if you could really see, there's this gap. Because sometimes when you're experimenting, things go wrong. I wasn't getting the right width that I needed for the experiment, so I actually just skipped ahead and I widened it so that it was the width I needed for the experiment. And this is a nice little reminder from the experimental point of view, like how things can go wrong and how you might try to fix it, but also it's informing me how I need to approach this in the future, because this problem did not happen in the previous experiment, but it did this time.
Let's see, so Hazel Crab asks, what can be used to waterproof fabric?
That's a great question.
And also the Council for British Archaeology wants to know, will this be going up on your channel after broadcast?
Yes, this will be available. I don't exactly know how long after the stream ends, possibly 1 to 2 hours, I think. I do have a series that I've been in the middle of editing where I try to explain all these different aspects more fully. But because I've been doing this experiment in my spare time, it takes time away from doing those videos. So if you do subscribe to the channel, those videos will be made eventually. And what was the first question?
They want.
Oh, waterproofing.
Yeah.
Yes. So I have considered 2 options with waterproofing from a material addition standpoint. So beeswax is a really good option for linen. And I've done this with one of my experimental pieces, like the small pieces I showed you before. I just took a piece of beeswax and I wiped it over the top of it. And I'm sure that if I took the extra time to melt it a little bit to smooth it out, it would be very, very waterproof. But also the density of the textile matters. So if you look at this one here, it's actually a lot more open weave. And if you look at this one is extremely dense in comparison. I don't know if you can really see that.
I'm gonna brighten this a little bit.
Okay. You can't really see through it. So it's extremely dense. So combination of the weave structure, how many threads that you have in your width of fabric. This one had 72 threads per loom weight, and there were 3 loom weights. So this turned out to be very dense in comparison to this one, which was 32 threads per loom weight. And because I was trying to keep the width roughly the same, this one is going to be more open weave just because the threads are the same for both, but there are fewer in this piece of fabric than there are for this one. And also this one is going to be a lot more rigid than this one. Is going to be very flexible in comparison, which is more like this one you see here. This you could turn into like a pair of trousers. It would be very nice to wear in the summer. This would probably be really great tent material, maybe. I don't know, or bags like for storage, like grain storage or something. I don't know. So yeah, beeswax is a thought that I've had. I don't know how archaeologically supported that is, but I just need to talk with more people. The other option is with wool. Wool has lanolin on there, which is already kind of like a waxy-like substance. And if you don't wash the lanolin out at a high temperature, you actually retain all of that coating on the wool fibers. And if you spin it, weave it that way, then you actually come up with something that is naturally very water resistant. And this is also another question for these combs, because I've had several made now. What were they used for? Because I've seen both of these types of tines, where this one, the spaces are very narrow, and this one, the spaces are very wide. I've opted to use this one for weaving, but it's not to say this one also couldn't. But because I've dedicated this one for a certain task and this one for a certain task, I don't really know. But if you were looking at wear patterns, for example, and this is something I've considered as well, if you're using a waterproof material, it also depends on when it's being applied. So if I was looking at a comb and thinking, well, there's a lot of wear pattern, I don't know what it is, and I do an experiment with unwashed wool that has the dirt has been washed away with cold water, the lanolin has been retained, then that lubrication is going to have an impact on what the wear patterns will look like on the comb. And there will also be a difference between wool and linen. So if I'm using this comb for a linen warp, I might not see any kind of lubrication wear traces if this is waterproofed after I've woven it. So you might take a piece of fabric that is otherwise not useful for whatever else and repurpose it as something that you might want to waterproof for whatever reason. So when you start asking these kinds of questions, it does kind of complicate the picture, and you do have to sort of explore each one with an experiment designed to look at that specific question, because doing it all together is really hard. So like I said before, when I'm doing work with these, it's not in reference to this actual question I'm asking, but it's helping me understand how I would go about doing a set of experiments to look at these more specifically, so that maybe we can try and figure out what they were used for. Any other questions? Maybe one quick one? I hope everyone was able to understand me when I start getting excited about my research and just start talking very quickly. Okay, well, like I said, if you want to follow my work, I'm on academia.edu. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want some more like tutorial follow-up videos about what I've been doing. I guess they're not really tutorial videos, just some educational videos about this process that I've done, and sort of like trying to bridge together what we kind of do innately with experimentation and experimental archaeology is a more organized methodology. And by all means, do a whole lot of experimentation. And if you are interested in doing this kind of research, there are loads of schools around the UK now that are offering degrees with experimental archaeology. But even if you're just doing sort of in my spare time, like I seem to be doing, there's also XArch. So they do experimental archaeology, and it's international. They've got conferences and all kinds of different kinds of crafts that they work with, and you can find them out if you just do a Google search for EXARC. So yeah, if there aren't any more questions right now, I will close this out. But if you do want to follow up with anything further, you can also post in the comments below the video, and I'll come back to and answer the questions as I can. All right. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you found this both interesting and enjoyable.